Hypatia, Harpi, i.e., Hypatia, she, often called Hypatia of Alexandria, was a Greek mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher in Egypt, then a part of the Eastern Roman Empire. She was the head of the Neoplatonic school at Alexandria, where she taught philosophy and astronomy. According to contemporary sources, Hypatia was murdered by a Christian mob after being accused of exacerbating a conflict between two prominent figures in Alexandria, the governor Orestes and the bishop of Alexandria. Life. The mathematician and philosopher Hypatia of Alexandria was the daughter of the mathematician Theon Alexandricus. She was educated in Athens. Around AD 400, she became head of the Platonist school at Alexandria, where she imparted the knowledge of Plato and Aristotle to students, including pagans, Christians, and foreigners. Although contemporary 5th-century sources identify Hypatia of Alexandria as a practitioner and teacher of the philosophy of Plato and Plotinus, 200 years later, the 7th-century Egyptian Coptic bishop John of Nicaea identified her as a Hellenistic pagan and that she was devoted at all times to magic, astrolabes and instruments of music, and she beguiled many people through her satanic wiles. However, not all Christians were as hostile towards her. Some Christians even used Hypatia as symbolic of virtue. The contemporary Christian historiographer Socrates Scholasticus described her in Ecclesiastical History. There was a woman at Alexandria named Hypatia, daughter of the philosopher Theon, who made such attainments in literature and science as to far surpass all the philosophers of her own time. Having succeeded to the school of Plato and Plotinus, she explained the principles of philosophy to her auditors, many of whom came from a distance to receive her instructions. On account of the self-possession and ease of manner which she had acquired in consequence of the cultivation of her mind, she not infrequently appeared in public in the presence of the magistrates. Neither did she feel abashed in going to an assembly of men, for all men on account of her extraordinary dignity and virtue admired her the more. Hypatia corresponded with former pupil Synesius of Cyrene, who was tutored by her in the philosophical school of Platonism and later became bishop of Ptolemais in AD 410, an exponent of the Christian Holy Trinity doctrine, together with the references by the pagan philosopher Damascius. These are the extant records left by Hypatia's pupils at the Platonist school of Alexandria. Death. Hypatia was murdered during an episode of citywide anger stemming from a feud between Orestes, the prefect of Alexandria, and Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria. Her death is symbolic for some historians. For example, Kathleen Wider proposes that the murder of Hypatia marked the end of classical antiquity, and Stephen Greenblatt observes that her murder effectively marked the downfall of Alexandrian intellectual life. On the other hand, Christian Wildberg notes that Hellenistic philosophy continued to flourish in the 5th and 6th centuries, and perhaps until the age of Justinian. Scholasticus account. The most complete account of Hypatia's death comes from the Historia Ecclesiastica, written around AD 415 by Socrates Scholasticus. Orestes, the Roman governor of Alexandria, and Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria, were involved in a bitter feud in which Hypatia became one of the main points of contention. In 415 AD, the feud began over Jewish dancing exhibitions in Alexandria, which attracted large crowds and were commonly prone to civil disorder of varying degrees. Orestes published an edict that outlined new regulations for such gatherings, and crowds gathered to read the edict shortly after it was posted in the city's theatre. The edict angered Christians as well as Jews. At one such gathering, Hyrax, a devout Christian follower of Cyril, read the edict and applauded the new regulations. Many people felt that Hyrax was attempting to incite the crowd into sedition. Orestes reacted swiftly and violently out of what Scholasticus suspected was jealousy of the growing power of the bishops, which encroached on the jurisdiction of the authorities. He ordered hierarchs to be seized and tortured publicly in the theatre. Hearing of hierarchs' severe and public punishment, Cyril threatened to retaliate against the Jews of Alexandria with the utmost severities, if the harassment of Christians did not cease immediately. In response to Cyril's threat, the Jews of Alexandria grew even more furious, eventually resorting to violence against the Christians. They plotted to flush out the Christians at night by running through the streets, claiming that the Church of Alexander was on fire. Christians responded to what they believed was their church burning down, and the Jews immediately fell upon and slew them, using rings to recognize one another in the dark and killing everyone else in sight. When the morning came, the Jews of Alexandria could not hide their guilt, and Cyril, along with many of his followers, took to the city's synagogues in search of the perpetrators of the massacre. Cyril rounded up all the Jews in Alexandria, then ordered them to be stripped of all possessions, banished them from Alexandria, and allowed their goods to be pillaged by the remaining citizens of Alexandria. Orestes was filled with great indignation at these transactions, and was excessively grieved that a city of such magnitude should have been suddenly bereft of so large a portion of its population. The feud between Cyril and Orestes intensified because of these things, and both men wrote to the emperor regarding the situation. Eventually, Cyril attempted to reach out to Orestes through several peace overtures, including attempted mediation. When that failed, he made an appeal to Orestes' allegiances as a Christian Roman, showing the Gospels to him. Nevertheless, Orestes remained unmoved by such gestures. Meanwhile, approximately 500 monks resided in the mountains of Nitria who were of a very fiery disposition. They heard of the ongoing feud between the governor and bishop and descended into Alexandria armed and prepared to fight alongside Cyril. Upon their arrival, the monks intercepted Orestes' chariot and proceeded to bombard and harass him, calling him a pagan idolater. In response to such allegations, Orestes countered that he was actually a Christian and had even been baptized by Atticus, the bishop of Constantinople. The monks paid little attention to Orestes' claims of Christianity, and one of the monks, named Ammonius, struck Orestes in the head with a rock, causing him to bleed profusely. At this point, Orestes' guards fled in fear, but a nearby crowd of Alexandrians came to his aid. Ammonius was subsequently captured and ordered to be tortured for his actions, during which he died. Following the death of Ammonius, Cyril ordered that he henceforth be remembered as a martyr. Such a proclamation did not sit well with sober-minded Christians, as Scholasticus pointed out. Seeing that he suffered the punishment due to his rashness, he would not deny Christ. This fact, according to Scholasticus, became apparent to Cyril through general lack of enthusiasm for Ammonius's case for martyrdom. Scholasticus then introduces Hypatia, the female philosopher of Alexandria and the woman who became a target of the Christian anger that was inflamed during the feud. She was the daughter of Theon and a teacher trained in the philosophical schools of Plato and Plotinus. She was admired by most for her dignity and virtue. Scholasticus writes that Hypatia ultimately fell victim to the political jealousy which at the time prevailed. Orestes was known to seek her counsel, and a rumor spread among the Christian community of Alexandria blaming her for Orestes' unwillingness to reconcile with Cyril. A mob of Christians gathered, led by a reader named Peter, whom Scholasticus calls a fanatic. They kidnapped Hypatia on her way home and took her to the church called Caesareum. They then completely stripped her, and then murdered her with tiles. Socrates. Scholasticus was interpreted as saying that, while she was still alive, Hypatia's flesh was torn off using oyster shells. Afterward, the men proceeded to mutilate her and, finally, burn her limbs. News of Hypatia's murder provoked great public denouncement, not only against Cyril but against the whole Alexandrian Christian community. Scholasticus closes with a lament. Surely nothing can be farther from the spirit of Christianity than the allowance of massacres, fights, and transactions of that sort. The account given in the Chronicle of John of Nicaea Hypatia's death is also told in another source, the Chronicle, written by John of Nicaea in Egypt around 650 AD. This account demonizes Hypatia and Orestes directly, while validating all Christians involved in the events Nicaea describes. The Chronicle is more biased on the matter of the historical feud, omitting several points of the narrative that are included in Scholasticus's account. Bishop John of Nicaea, who lived several hundred years after the events he describes, writes bitterly of Hypatia, claiming that she beguiled many people through satanic wiles. Orestes, who Nicaea writes was himself a victim of Hypatia's demonic charm, regularly honored her and abandoned the Christian Church in order to follow her teachings more closely. Moreover, the bishop claimed that Orestes himself persuaded others to leave the church in favor of Hypatia's philosophical teachings and went as far as to host such unbelievers at his house. One day, Orestes published an edict regarding public exhibitions in the city of Alexandria, and all citizens gathered to read the edict. Cyril, curious to see why the edict caused such an uproar, sent Hierax, a Christian possessing understanding and intelligence, who, although opposed to paganism, did as Cyril asked and went to learn the nature of Orestes' edict. Meanwhile, the Jews who gathered in anger over the edict believed that Hierax had come only for the sake of provocation. Upon this assumption, Orestes had Hierax punished for a crime for which he was wholly guiltless. For the punishment and torture of Hierax, as well as the death of several monks, including Ammonius, Cyril grew increasingly furious with Orestes. Cyril then warned the Jews against any further harm upon the Christians. However, with the support of Orestes, the Jews felt confident in defying Cyril's authority, and so one night ran through the streets proclaiming, "The Church of the Apostolic Athanasius is on fire. Come to its succor, all ye Christians." The Christians responded to the alarms only to be slaughtered by the Jews in a coordinated ambush. The next morning, all remaining Christians of the town came to Cyril with news of the massacre, after which Cyril marched with them to purge the Jews from Alexandria. In so doing, Cyril allowed the pillaging of their possessions, and soon after purified all the synagogues in the city and made them into churches. In the expulsion of the Jews, Orestes was unable to offer them any assistance. Shortly thereafter, a group of Christians, under Peter the magistrate, went looking for Hypatia, the pagan woman who had beguiled the people of the city and the prefect through her enchantments. They found her sitting in a chair, at which point they seized and brought her to the great church, named Caesarion, where they proceeded to rip the clothes off her body. Then they dragged her through the streets of Alexandria until she died and burned her remains. Nicaea's description of Hypatia's death also differs from that of Scholasticus. Following the death of Hypatia, Bishop Cyril was named the new Theophilus. With the death of Hypatia, Nicaea writes, the Christians had expelled the last remnant of pagan idolatry. Comparison of the two accounts works. No written work widely recognized by scholars as Hypatia's own has survived to the present time. Many of the works commonly attributed to her are believed to have been collaborative works with her father, Theon Alexandricus. This kind of authorial uncertainty is typical for female philosophers in antiquity. A partial list of Hypatia's works is mentioned by other antique and medieval authors or as posited by modern authors. A commentary on the 13-volume Arithmetica by Diophantus. A commentary on the Conics of Apollonius. Edited the existing version of Ptolemy's Almagest. Edited her father's commentary on Euclid's Elements. She wrote a text, the Astronomical Canon. Her contributions to technology are reputed to include the invention of the hydrometer, used to determine the relative density of liquids. However, the hydrometer was invented before Hypatia, and already known in her time. Some say that this is a textual misinterpretation of the original Greek, which mentions a hydroscopium, a clock that works with water and gears. similar to the Antikythera mechanism. Her student Synesius, bishop of Cyrene, wrote a letter describing his construction of an astrolabe. Earlier astrolabes predate that of Synesius by at least a century, and Hypatia's father had gained fame for his treatise on the subject. However, Synesius claimed that his was an improved model. Synesius also sent Hypatia a letter describing a hydrometer, and requesting her to have one constructed for him.